Hello there again, and it's good to have you back on the AM show. But it's time now to bring you that special roundtable I've been talking about all morning. The fact that Joy Business is bringing you the special conversation on Ghana's tax regime, which is considered to be very, very high. We're looking at the causes and, exploring the possible remedies that could address this situation. And that's why we're having the discussion on the causes, the solution to Ghana's high tax systems. Our guests are ready, but Winston Amwa will be taking over from now to bring you that conversation as it takes off right now. Winston?
Well, thank you very much, Blessed Sugan. So we're about to get into that all-important conversation about Ghana's high tax regime, the causes and finding remedies. And there's a discussion on the causes and solutions to Ghana's high tax system. This morning, we're joined by Professor Charles Aka, who is an economist and associate professor at the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research. He's joining us in studio. And we also get to, be joined by George Kwatia, who is president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Ghana. He'll be joining us via Zoom. And Dr. John Kwatia is director of Research, Institute of Economic Affairs, also joining us via Zoom. And I'm sure you may have heard this over and over and over again, that Ghana's tax to GDP compared to our peers, not the best. We've always talked about the situation where Ghana's 13% tax to GDP ratio woefully inadequate. We've cited examples such as Burkina Faso, that's over 20%. We've talked about Congo, La Côte d'Ivoire. Congo is at some 29.3%, and La Côte d'Ivoire also around 15.5%. So the critical question is, one, is it that we're not paying more taxes? Is it a case of taxing the already burdened with more, or we're not widening? And talking about widening the base, this is a conversation we've had over and over and over again. We've always talked about widening the tax net. Why is it so difficult for us to widen the tax net? This morning, that's a conversation we're having right here on the AM show, and is also live on the Super Morning Show on Joy 99.7 FM. It's Joy Business organizing this, and my name is Winston Amwa. And as already indicated, we have Professor Charles Aka in studio with us. Prof, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning.
And I believe that you're doing very well this morning.
Yes, by God's grace.
Great. Before we get into everything, and we're also joined on Zoom by Mr. Kwatia, who is the president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Ghana. Good morning, sir, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning. And
Great.
Good morning to the viewers and listeners.
That's George Kwatia. I'll be joined shortly by Dr. John Kwatia, who is head of research of the Institute of Economic Affairs. But let me start off with you in studio, Professor Charles Aka. We've talked about this over and over again. This will not be the first time. Probably may not be the last. Our hope is that this becomes the last time we're talking about this situation. Consistently, we've talked about Ghana's tax to GDP. In fact, as part of our IMF program, we want to raise it to some 18% by the time we're done. We've asked ourselves that simple question. What is our problem? First of all, is the 13 adequate? Well, we say it's inadequate. What could make it adequate? Is it a case that we're not taxing the right sectors? We have fewer taxes? Well, the evidence says we have a lot of taxes. What is the problem?
Thank you very much. There are several determinants of this low tax capacity and tax effort. So the first thing is to find out what are the determinants of a good tax revenue in a country. And one of them is the structure of the economy. So, i.e., if the economy is structured, formalized in a way that the economy is also growing, then you can raise more tax. So, for example, you have a situation where a major part of the economy is informal sector. Another major part is mainly agriculture and trading, retailing, and wholesaling. The formal sector, manufacturing, for example, industry, is totally not doing very well. So then that kind of structure already limits your ability to raise a very critical part of tax handle, which is personal income tax. So personal income tax is quite low. Corporate taxes are also quite low because major parts of the corporate sector is informal, and therefore we haven't found innovative ways of taxing them. So then there are few companies large companies that seems to be overburdened. And also the economy has not been growing. Over the last couple of years, we have not grown consistently beyond 5% of GDP for, say, more than 3-4 years. Many times at the moment now, over the last 3 years, our growth is averaging around 2-3%. It's forecast this year to grow less than 2%. So the more the economy is growing, then if it is formalized properly, you can get more tax revenue. Because we're also not growing, you have a lot of huge unemployment, particularly young people who have finished school. They don't get a job for 7 years. So you can't raise tax revenue from them. Okay, so it's the structure of the economy and it's the way to think outside the box to see how do we bring in all the various sectors of the economy to contribute. Property, for example, huge properties, very expensive, high-end properties all over in the urban centers, Accra, Tema, Kumasi, Takoradi. They are not contributing adequately to the tax revenue.
So if I get you clearly, part of the problem we're faced with is the fact that our economy isn't growing at the rate that it should for us to be paying more taxes.
Yeah, that's a key part. And for the economy to grow means that there has to be adequate investment. Okay. The investment has to come in, for example, investing in the competitiveness of the economy to make sure that businesses are making good profit, because the business make profit, they pay tax. And you have to make sure that all businesses are formalized, or a major part of the business are formalized. You have to invest in the economy in such that there's good infrastructure that makes people to be able to do business and earn good income. You have to formalize the sector in such a way that people finish school and they're able to get a job, then they can pay their income taxes. So when that investment is lacking, and agriculture investment is also lacking, so even farmers are not making good profits, and they are not even formalized. So then your ability to tax them is low, because one of the determinants of tax revenue is the GDP level, or per capita income. Our per capita income in Ghana is about $2,300, $2,400 per annum. So which means that if you divide the whole GDP by the 30 million people in Ghana, everybody's annual income is just about $2,500. So even if you tax it at 20%, your tax revenue is limited by the per capita income. If the per capita income increased to, say, $5,000, or like Korea, about $33,000 per capita, every Korean earns about $33,000 per year. That's the total GDP of Korea divided by the total population. Then even a tax of 10% on everybody raises quite a lot of revenue. So if economy does not grow, it limits the capacity to raise revenue. That's one of the critical things.
We'll come to this shortly, but let me get to Mr. George Kwatia, who is president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Ghana. What do you also think accounts for the low tax to GDP ratio?
Let me probably start by giving some context to this. In 2010, tax to GDP was about 10.8%. Then 10 years down the line in 2020, we got to this 13.4% that we are looking at. But incidentally, it dropped to 12.3% in 2022. If you look at the media review budget, the revenue forecast of about 108 million for tax revenues. Obviously, knowing that our GDP hasn't drastically changed, if not increased, then we are expecting even a much lower tax to GDP growth in 2023. So essentially, we are seeing a trend that after the 2020, we are having a kind of declining GDP to tax to GDP ratio, which is the issue that I guess we should be worried about. Prof has alluded to a couple of reasons why we have a low GDP to tax to GDP ratio, and what I want to say here is that from our perspective, from the tax perspective, yes, we do have issues relating to the economy, which he has shared. It's agrarian and subsistence in nature. And we all know that our tax laws essentially exempts agriculture, and for that matter, farming, from taxes. So if you have a greater percentage of the population in a sector, a very significant sector that is not paying taxes or is exempt from tax, obviously then it means that you're going to have a much smaller percentage of the population paying taxes. We also have issues of, as you mentioned, with the foreign direct investments, where we have big companies in the extractive industry actually commanding most of the tax contribution. We have instances where these companies may be engaged in profit shifting, which relates to transfer pricing, whereby little is left in this environment to attract tax. We also have people evading taxes and avoiding taxes. We have a very high informal labor force. Statistics point to the fact that in 2020, for instance, the income tax from formal employment as a percentage to self-employed was 17-1, and it is even projected that this is going to move from 18-1, which means that from the formal sector, which is a much smaller sector of our economy, individuals contribute 17, let me say, even if it is cedis, as compared to self-employed person contributing 1 cedi. So that is also an issue, because you have the self-employed group being the greater percentage of the population. And if they are contributing 1, as against 17 from the smaller employed group, then obviously you're going to have a low tax to GDP ratio. We also have, like Prof said, we have also a very limited tax base in terms of high unemployment. We have casual labor, temporary employees, or temporary jobs. When you have an economy which is going through situations like this, then it means those who will contribute to your tax revenues are essentially a very small percentage of people. We also have the challenge, I know you would get to this, when we have tax incentives and exemptions. Companies in the extractive industry have stability clauses in their agreements, various model agreements that we sign as a country. We do not design those model agreements. They are designed by the developed countries, and it is just passed on to us. And obviously, if you are not able to design your own form of agreement, you being told that there is a so-called best practice, and that is what is done globally, and therefore you are also pinned down to accepting those conditions. Let me give you a typical example. Before the advent of maybe formal tax system, royalties, we all know, when our great-grandfathers lease out their land for farming, we had a system of a bunu and a visa, and therefore royalty rate was hovering around 30 to 50%. Now we have improved, we have grown, we have been knowledgeable, we have been educated, and then we take royalties at 10%. We've clearly shifted away from our own traditional way of, or let me say, our own homegrown base of royalty computations to something that has been handed over by, let me say, by foreigners, and we take it, we swallow it hook, line, and sinker. We also have issues relating to the lethargic tax administration system we have. We have a situation where for a very long time, we do not have a lot of specialisms and specialists in the tax administration. I've been in an environment where I've been part of a tax audit team, and this was a hospital. And in that tax audit team was a doctor. So obviously, if you are going to do an audit in the petroleum downstream sector, and you have no clue as to what the engineers do and how they compute things, you would obviously not be able to extract the level of taxes that you should, just because you do not have the expertise of that particular industry. So we also have, interestingly, our laws are so couched and structured that focuses on companies as against individuals. We all know that individuals and sole proprietorship or enterprises constitute the significant percentage of the business community. Yet when we are passing our tax laws, we tend to focus on companies as against enterprises and individuals. A typical example is our Growth and Stability Levy. Clearly under the law, entities are defined to exclude individuals, and individuals do not necessarily mean the individual person, but it's individual's business. And enterprises or sole proprietorships, the entities which are not registered as companies are individual entities. Withholding tax, for instance, individuals are precluded from withholding tax. So even if you are dealing with somebody as an individual and you're paying, and the law precludes you from withholding, and even though if you had had that mandate to withhold, it would have contributed to the tax net, our laws do not give that opportunity. We also have instances of frequent tax policy changes. We don't even have a national tax policy, an effective national tax policy as yet.
Okay.
And with frequent changes, you also have uncertainty in the environment, and it reduces the level of compliance, because it always takes some time for people to appreciate, understand, and then be able to do the right tax computations whenever you change tax laws. We can learn from the experiences we've had as a country, especially with respect to when we're introducing VAT and e-levy. There's very little
Mr. Kwatia,
consultation.
Yes, just before you continue, I mean, you've talked about all the problems that we're going through. So based on all of these challenges...
So all these things contribute to our low tax base.
So with all these, factors that you've enumerated, and based on the multiple, levies and taxes that we have, is it your view that currently we have enough taxes in place, or we have enough tax measures, as in multiple levies and taxes in place, to raise the requisite tax revenue?
Sure. Let me just share an issue with you. We had a World Bank conducting a study in 2020 with respect to Ghana's tax gap. And the bottom line of that study was the fact that Ghana, with respect to three taxes, which is import duties, corporate tax, and VAT, we had a tax gap of about 20%. If you take 2021 GDP estimate of about $77.6 billion, if you work out the 20% on the 77.6 billion and you translate it to its CD equivalent, depending on the exchange rate you use, we are talking about 155 to 170 billion as tax gap. If you look at our total tax revenue, as I've mentioned, for the revised one for 2023, government is only looking at 108 billion, whilst you have a tax gap of about 55 to 70 billion. So obviously, if you really are a country that want to invest and make sure that you roll in the right taxes, in my view, it's not about more taxes, but it's rather an investment into making sure that you close the tax gap. And if we are able to do so, for instance, we should be able to double our tax revenues from the neighborhoods of 108 billion to almost 250 and even more billion cedis.
Let's take that point again. You say we don't need more taxes. What must we do?
That's why I say we look at the tax gap and then try to close it. So more investment should go into closing the tax gap. But if you want to look at other areas that we can also improve, I think we need to have a very simplified tax system that makes things easier for especially the informal sector to appreciate and comply. There should be some level of increased tax transparency, and people should know how much their taxes contribute to the development of the country. We know we run a centralized system of government, and more often than not, you get all these excuses, if I should call it quote unquote, that yes, we take your taxes from Accra, but we built a hospital in Bolgatanga or Tamale or in, let me say, Bibiani. And people don't tend to appreciate that because the person is living in Accra, paying taxes, and then it's used to develop the country as a whole, which is good. But incidentally, there isn't much education and there isn't much to talk about with respect to the investments that the tax monies are used for. And if it is so, then you will realize that people have a very cold attitude towards tax payment because they do not see, especially in their immediate environment, what the taxes are used for. So I would say government should also look at, in trying to improve tax compliance, government should also look at ceding some amounts to the district and regional assemblies for them to undertake infrastructural projects within the communities that the tax is extracted from. And that obviously would engender a good level of compliance, and will be able to increase our tax revenues and, for that matter, our tax to GDP. We've been always talking about broadening the tax net. We are saddled with a host of exemptions. Maybe the way to broaden it is to curb these exemptions or possibly eliminate it. I know we have had an exemption tax act passed, which is good, but we can do more by way of reducing the level of exemptions that we grant. There's been a study by ONTAC which proves that actually exemptions do not even yield any investments at all. FDIs do not necessarily be attracted by tax exemptions. If a mining company has the geological database of gold in a given area, that is what they are interested in. And they will not be interested in, that will not change their investment decision, even if you grant or do not grant them exemptions. And we can also look at reducing evasion and equipping our people to be able to appreciate the nuances of profit shifting and transfer pricing, avoidance schemes. Maybe we also need to look at our penalties. Our penalty in the law, in my view, is not punitive enough to deter people from not complying. So there are a host of other things we can talk about. I don't want to be leading the point of course, one too can say maybe there are some areas talking about new taxes. Maybe there are some areas that we need to look at. We know that businesses are getting more digital, and as a country, we need to look at digital services tax and quickly come up with our own position by way of how to tax digital services, because
exactly. That's one thing the Ghana Revenue Authority has been talking about. They say they're doing. But let me bring in, Professor Akar. He's talked about all the challenges. But I'd want to start off something with you. You've talked about the fact that if we're to grow the economy, first of all, if we grow the economy, we increase our GDP, automatically, once there's more activity, we'll have more taxes. So let's look at, what we have been talking about. We've been playing, currently our GDP projected to end the year at 800 billion cedis. So that's about $70 billion, if I could put it that way. So at this rate, what rate of growth must we have to be able to achieve the 20% that we talk about, all things being equal, with the current tax regime?
Well, so it's expected that the country grows is about the consistency of the growth and also the level of growth. In our history, for about 2 decades, we've been growing around an average of about 5%. That's the best we have achieved. There are times where, when we found oil in 2011, we had about 11 to 12% growth, and then it came down again. For many, many periods, we grow around less than 3%, 4%, 5%. My estimation shows that if we do the right kind of investment, we should be targeting about 7% GDP growth for a decade. When we are able to, and I don't think that's possible under an IMF program, because the IMF program actually brings in austerity.
But the IMF program seeks to increase tax to GDP to 18%.
Yeah, that's the target.
Yeah, within the medium term. Are you saying that is not feasible?
No, it's not feasible because the only way to do that is to impose new and additional taxes, and that brings us back to the question we have. The IMF is asking that VAT must be increased. So VAT is increased from 12.5% to 15%,
yeah,
which is actually counterproductive in a high inflation environment. We introduce more excise taxes on companies and businesses, which is counterproductive in a high inflation environment. Okay, so you can increase your tax to GDP ratio by imposing high taxes and more taxes, but that again is counterproductive because it stifles.
How is it counterproductive? Help me understand.
Yeah, because taxes affect incentives. So if you take, for example, income tax. So income tax affects labor supply. Okay, if I'm going to work and I know that 50% of my income is going to go into tax, it already, as an economic rational being, you decide, well, is it worth it? Should I go and work and pay half of my income to tax, and I don't know what they're going to use the tax for? So all things being equal, the lower tax rate creates an incentive for people to supply labor. In the same way as a business, corporate tax. No business want to work and pay 50-60% of their profit into tax. So we need low tax rate and a higher or bigger tax base. That's what other countries are doing. What we are doing is raising more additional tax. When you buy a commodity now, apart from the VAT that's 15%, you have about another 6% additional taxes. Get fund, COVID, all of that. That 6% is applied before VAT is applied on that. It's not that's not what's supposed to be done in other countries. So if you want to have a VAT, you have a VAT 15%, 16%. That's all. You don't impose so much taxes on petroleum products. So much taxes are the customs. All of those things incentivize people to evade or to avoid or to go into bribery and all those kind of things. So the best way to grow your tax revenue is actually to formalize, to make sure that you broaden the tax base, which means that if everybody is contributing towards the tax revenue, you can reduce the tax rate. And as you said, you need to simplify the tax system, which means that you don't need 5, 6, 7 different taxes on a product or on commodities or on a company. If it's 1 or 2, that's it. It's very simple enough for people to grow. Then let the economy grow. As the economy is growing, the economy can only grow by investment, by savings, by profit, by people getting employment and getting good income. At the moment, that's not the case. So you see that, and he mentioned about the informal sector. The informal sector, for me, is quite huge because it contributes almost 67 to 70% of self-employment, of employment in Ghana. So if we don't find innovative way of bringing in the self-employed sector into the tax net, we will continue to have high corporate taxes and high income taxes and high VAT, because then we are just looking at the small formal sector.
But Professor Aka, as we talk about all these challenges, the reality also is that the Ghana Revenue Authority has been exceeding its targets. So, in 2022, they, achieved a target. Their target was 71.95 billion, and they raised some 75.71 billion. That's exceeding their target. So the question is, if we're exceeding our targets, isn't that an indication that we're doing well? Why the need to impose more taxes?
Well, so the question is, who set the target?
The government. The executive said the target for the Ghana Revenue Authority. There are those who think maybe we're not setting an ambitious target.
Yes, that's the issue. So
you think our targets are not ambitious enough?
Somebody setting his questions and marking himself. That's basically. So the Minister of Finance gets estimate from the Ghana Revenue Authority, and the Ghana Revenue Authority said that this is how much we want to achieve, and you need to ask. So look at the budget 2023 and see how much they want to raise from property taxes. Okay, less than 200 million Ghana cedi. See how much they want to raise from self-employment. So that's already quite too low. And of course, that will be achieved. What we need to do now probably is for Parliament to begin to set the target for the Ghana Revenue Authority, and to have people to be employed who will achieve the target. If they don't achieve that target, maybe they face some consequences or some penalties. If we don't do that, we employ people. And the same thing happens at the Assembly. We have MMDAs, district chief executives. They're supposed to raise revenue from property taxes, from rates.
They're looking at raising some 165 million
from
property taxes.
Yeah, but if you do an analysis, and I did some analysis, if you do property taxes, for example, my own analysis I did 167 million.
Yes.
Okay. Just according to the Ghana
165 million. Actually.
Million.
Yes.
Okay. So look at that. According to the Ghana population census, there are about 8.5 million plus completed residential structures in Ghana. 1.7 million of those structures are in Greater Accra. So Accra alone has about 1.7 million structures. Now, if you do the analysis, what the government is saying is that even if we decide that all this 167 million is going to be raised from Accra alone, forget about Kumasi, Takoradi, and the rest of the economy, divide the 167 million by the structures in Accra, you get each property is going to pay just about 97 Ghana cedi a year. So which means that this is quite low. Just Accra alone, if you decided to raise just about 0.25% on the properties in Accra, you will be raising about 11 billion Ghana cedi by my analysis. Just even focus on East Legon Airport Residential, wetlands, and here. And look at all the real estate. When I was coming, people were advertising real estate. They are quoting them in dollars. Okay, so you can buy a property in East Legon for $200,000, 1 million Ghana cedis. And if people are not asked to pay property rate, then you set a target of 167 million. When you are supposed to raise, you could raise as much as 12 billion from property taxes alone, from Accra alone, by my analysis. So property tax actually holds a huge potential if we were just even picking Accra, Kumasi, Takoradi to start with. If we cannot even roll out the whole country and say, okay, let's focus on Greater Accra, Kumasi, Metropolis, and Western Region, Accra, Secondary Takoradi. And let's value the properties that are in Greater Accra. If you even do it for just Accra, East Legon, Airport Residential, Osu alone, the properties there, and value them and say that we are going to impose a tax of 0.5% or 0.1% or 0.05% on the values, you will not be talking about 167 million Ghana cedi in a year. So that's actually low. The same thing, look at self-employed, how much they are trying to raise from self-employed. And you see that again, the self-employed...
self-employed is 856 million.
856 million. Yeah. There are 9.9 million self-employed people in Ghana. 9.9 million self-employed. Okay. Out of that 9.9 million, 6.6 million of them are formalized, i.e. they have employees. So when somebody has a self-employed, whether it's a hairdresser or is a barber or is a mechanic that has apprentices and has 2 or 3 employees. That's not an informal sector job. That's a business that is within the community. It's in Adenta, it's in Osu, it's in a structure. It's not even a hawker. This is not something, it doesn't take rocket science for this self-employed business to be registered and for them to pay the appropriate tax. I did a small calculation by a barber, the barber I go to where I barber my hair.
Yes.
Yeah, and this barber has been there for more than 15 years since I've been living in Adenta. More than 15 years. When I go there, haircut is 20 Ghana cedi. I ask him, how many people do you barber a day? He said, at least 10 people. On Saturdays and Sundays, he gets as much as 30 people coming to barber.
Okay.
By my calculation, every month he gets about 9,000 Ghana cedi. That's more than a teacher's salary. That's more than a nurse. That's actually almost equal to what a professor takes. And so when you are taxing the university security officer who earns about just 800 Ghana cedi, the nurse or the cleaner in Kolebu who earns just about 700 Ghana cedi, and you impose income tax on him. And then you have people doing business like barber, hairdressers, mechanics who are not in the bush. They are right in the community. They've been there for 10 years, 20 years. And you cannot rate, they are earning as much as 9,000 a month, 20,000 a month. Some of them count a lot, about 1 million Ghana cedi in a week. And you don't find a way of taxing them even 5% of their revenue every month. You will not raise your tax revenue. Then you will now go and concentrate on the formal sector, people like me, small businesses, and impose high taxes on them, increase VAT to 15%, impose a lot of excise duties that is now crippling businesses. You will not grow the economy. People will find a way of avoiding and evading the tax, and you come back the same way, not achieving your target. So I've just wanted to show that even if you look at the budget, the targets are not ambitious enough. Our tax effort is too low, is inadequate. That's what the World Bank analysis he was mentioning shows, that if you take even corporate tax, the tax gap is about 84%, which we are raising only just about 16% of the potential. We could have raised more revenue from the corporate sector than we are doing. If you come to VAT, it's the same thing. If you come to import duty, which there's a lot of evasion at the customs, we could have raised about 30% more revenue from import duty than we are raising. So we need to look at the tax administration and reform it and set them ambitious target and let them raise the revenue. Otherwise, we'll keep going to IMF, because when you don't raise enough revenue, you need to borrow. And if you don't borrow from your central bank, you need to go and borrow from the international capital market.
So let me get the point clearly. It's your view that if we do, for instance, if we were to formalize, and even let's put that aside, if we were to collect taxes from the self-employed who are already formalized, we'll be good to go.
We'll be good to go, because you have almost 10 million self-employed. And let's say some of these self-employed people, you may not be able to really raise taxes. But there are about 6 million of them that they may not be registered with as companies, but they are formal. Formal in the sense that they have a location, we know the people. Now we have Ghana card. Most of them have Ghana card. They have a phone number. They have employees. They have apprentices. So these people can be formalized. And we have to charge the MMDAs to do that, because they are located in the Accra Metro. They are located in Adenta. They are located in Medina. So instead of asking the MMDAs to depend on the common fund as their main source of revenue, and then we don't set them any target, they are not competing. We need to take the China model. In China, for example, they made the communes, or what we call the districts and assemblies, to be competing every year. So appointment to be a DCE is based on your tax performance. So we know that, and what we need to ask the Ghana Tax Service to try to do for us is to, instead of giving us a GDP for Ghana, is to begin to give us GDP per region and GDP per MMDA. So we need to know what is Adenta's potential GDP. What is its GDP to contribute? So let's suppose if Adenta, the GDP in a year in Adenta for 2023 is say, let's say 10 billion, then we can say, okay, there's a lot of business activity, properties, commerce going on in Adenta. There are a lot of high income earners in Adenta. Your GDP as a contribution to Ghana's GDP is about 10 billion. You must raise about 20% of that GDP in tax revenue for you to continue to be a DCE. And that is a competition for all the districts. And when you bring that competition, because now Adenta will be competing with Medina, they'll be competing with Ayawaso. And they know that if I don't reach my target, I will face a penalty or I'll be fired another person will be appointed to take the place. That kind of competition already enhances revenue mobilization.
The thing about decentralization, you're right, is that it's supposed to lead to some competition between the districts. And so in the delivery of public service and public good, if your district is doing very well, the other district will be forced to also do well. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, also because these persons are appointed and there is no form of assessment, nobody's going to come back and say, you did not perform, go for the next person. And, all we do is just to wait for government to appoint them. That's actually the problem. But let me bring in George Kwatia in at this point. He's been crunching the figures. He is the president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation. Look, in other jurisdictions, taxes that will be implemented 3, 4, 5 years from now, discussions are already being had. In our part of the world, it looks like every time we look for money, and then we quickly gather and say, which area can we tax? The question is, what is Ghana's tax policy? Do we even have one? And how is that helping us in achieving our tax or revenue targets?
Thank you again. I guess I had alluded to this issue or this challenge as to whether we do even have an effective national tax policy. If you talk to the policy unit of the Ministry of Finance, they would assure you that yes, there's one in the pipeline. It is awaiting the minister's approval before it will be made public. That is the feedback I get because I specifically asked this question. But yes, you're right. If we had a tax policy, a national tax policy, we would all be guided by that policy. Like you're rightly saying, that if even within that policy we spell out timelines for which tax laws or policies will come into force, then we all know. But incidentally, here we are, things are shrouded in some kind of environment that it's not very transparent, let me put it that way. Things that you would expect probably people to be bold to tell you that, no, we don't have one. You always get the excuse, the typical Ghanaian balance. It is being worked on. We are working on it. It is in the pipeline and all those kind of things. But I think it is high time we have a tax policy, and all stakeholders will be interested to ensuring that we all abide or go by the policy. Incidentally, taking into account the various manifesto of ruling governments and those kind of things, we tend to also get surprises because somebody will say, well, I promised ABC, and that is the only way I can achieve it. So probably it suits various governments for us not to have a document like that, which we can pin them down to. But I totally subscribe to the fact that we need to have a national tax policy. And we have to, if we don't have it, as I see it to be, we have to quickly put one together and approve it and get all stakeholders to contribute to that policy document.
But you've also talked about the stability clauses and agreements in some of the agreements within the extractive sector. Now, this is a major issue. Going forward, how do we deal with these?
Well, I think going forward is good you are asking going forward because those agreements have already been crystallized. Yes. And we do not have the capacity to apply taxes retrospectively. So it is increasingly a big challenge. Even if you introduce new taxes, it's a big challenge if you can succeed getting any contributions from these companies that have their stability clauses enshrined in the agreement that they've signed with government, because those agreements obviously take precedence over our local laws. We always see in the various enactments that we introduce as new taxes that where there's a contradiction between this act and any other act, blah, 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 this particular act takes precedence. But it doesn't work that way, because you already have a legally binding agreement with an entity where they've already put in all these stability clauses. So yes, it is a big challenge to us in trying to improve our revenue drive, because these companies have been around and they will still be around with us, but then they obviously will stick to their guns based on whatever stability clauses they have and push for their rights. If you don't want to incur financial losses and those things by being sent to an external arbitration or whatever, or court, then you just have to back down. We have had instances where recently an oil company wanted to push, a power producing company wanted to push to take Ghana to court, an outside court. And obviously, you know that you, as a country, it is also not good enough an image for the country when you have investors complaining that you turn your back on contracts that you have committed yourself into signing. So stability clauses are a very big challenge to us, and it is going to be increasingly difficult, as I see it, to deal with the past. But going forward, I guess some of the things we need to do is to have sunset clauses in these agreements, such that if we sign any agreement with a stability clause, there should be an end point or a given time to say that this agreement has to be revisited, or this agreement ends on this date and we have to renegotiate. If we don't do that, then we're going to have these stability clauses running ad infinitum, which is not good for us. We also need to get our people to really understand and appreciate when we are signing these agreements, because my experience in our environment is when you're dealing with the foreign direct investors, they come in with the top-notch experts to really discuss and negotiate these agreements. We rather probably do not even have the expertise in this area. Okay. And our politicians or our political leaders go and get these documents signed without really appreciating the nuances of what they have signed. I'm not saying that they are naive, but I think if you're dealing with an expert, a seasoned, well-trained guy in a particular industry field, negotiating with you, and you have just very little knowledge about that industry, I guess you already have set yourself up to fail. All right. We need to build that capacity and use that capacity we build in getting these agreements underway going forward.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. George Kwatia, who is president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation, Ghana. And a big thank you to you also, Professor Charles Acker, for making time to join us. That's all from us. My name is Winston Amon. Coming up as News Desk. Have a lovely day.